form of human being, probably still Homo sapiens, that is really very similar to modern man. Mitochondrial DNA from Neanderthals has been studied, taken from the bones of Neanderthals, and there's about 4 times, I think it's like 4 or 5 times as much difference between the Neanderthals and modern humans as between different groups of modern humans. So the idea is that they were a group that diverged from the main line that led to modern humans some hundreds of thousands of years ago. The other thing about evolving from a rock, well, if life evolved from non-living matter, then obviously some inorganic substances became part of organic living cells. But let's see, I don't quite see what that has to do. What was the second part of that? The rock and the constant chemical reactions or something? I think I'll just leave that one.
I confess I don't understand the question either. I do understand a good part of it. As far as humans and Neanderthals, I think the evidence indicates, even though Neanderthals are presented as part of the evolutionary chain in the typical textbook, the evidence from the Neanderthals is that they are just human. They're within the range of humans. The 4% difference that he mentioned is certainly still within the range of humans. Dr. Cuazzo has written a fascinating book on this called Buried Alive. He was one of the few men to actually go study the actual bones. Most people, when they study fossils and learn about evolution, they get to study a copy of the fossil, a casting or a replica. You ought to read this book, Buried Alive. You can get it through my ministry or get it through him. He lives in New Jersey. I can get you his phone number if you want. Call him, ask him any questions directly. He's a dentist. He studied Neanderthals very thoroughly and wrote this very conclusive book about it and said, folks, they're just a human, that most of them had acromegaly, excessive secretion of growth hormone in old age. The bones in the forehead start to get thicker. When a person passes 80 or 90 years of age, the forehead starts to thicken, gets thick-headed. And he's thinking these people are probably over 100, and they develop slower. He found much evidence of slower, delayed maturation. Today, people mature and are able to produce children when they're 12 and 13. These are probably more like 16 or 18 or 20, delayed maturation. And it's just a fascinating book answering about the Neanderthals. As far as humans or anything coming from a rock, that's my whole point. It didn't happen. But ultimately, if you boil away the big words, the evolutionist has to believe we came from a rock 4.6 billion years ago. I mean, there's no way out of the argument. That's what they believe. They keep trying to hide and say, well, we're only talking about living organisms evolving. Well, then get the rest of the stuff out of the books. Join me. Help me get that stuff out of there. That would be a good cause.
All right, thank you. We have 10 minutes remaining in our question and answer session, and we'd like to take the opportunity for each doctor to present a question to the other and then allow them 2 minutes to respond to that. So we'll start with Dr. Paulson if you'd like to ask Dr. Hovind a question.
Yeah, get a minute to get prepared.
Or we can start with the other, either or. Do you have a question?
Oh, I got lots of questions,
right.
Sure.
We'll start with you.
I still would like to know, you mentioned that there's libraries full of evidence for evolution. Would you please simplify it down? What is the best evidence you know of? You said you studied this for 28 years. What is the best evidence you know of any kind of animal producing a different kind? You mentioned about the gull, the white and the black gull. If that is not your best evidence, please tell me what is. Don't just say there's lots of evidence. Just please tell me your best one.
Will you tell me first what a kind is?
I did. You said I didn't give the definition of kind, and I did. I said animals that originally were able to reproduce living viable offspring. And they may have diversified now, where for some reason they're no longer able to reproduce. Great Dane and a Chihuahua. Well, technically they can have a few mechanical problems, but the biblical created kinds were those that were capable of reproducing a viable offspring, which was also capable of reproducing. So that would be a good definition of kind. That's the best I come up with for the moment.
this is quite an amazing thing, because these people who call themselves creation scientists have this idea of a kind, and they have no idea what it means. You just can't pin them down. I gave you a good definition for what a species is. It's a group of creatures that can interbreed, a group of animals or plants that can productively interbreed, and that's the definition of a species. That's a well-defined concept. There are some difficulties when you have transitions taking place, like the two gulls, but let me give my best evidence for this idea. Dr. Hovind's been talking about what? Dogs and bananas? Well, let's talk about dogs and peas, because I don't happen to have any knowledge of data on bananas, but I think if you can show it for peas, you can show it for bananas. And by the way, I haven't studied evolution for 28 years. I've studied biochemistry. But one of the things I have studied for almost 28 years is proteins that are in chromosomes called histones. And there's one of those called histone H3. There's 5 of them, 5 main classes altogether, but there's one called histone H3 that is very conserved in evolution. The explanation for this is that it has so many functions, so many parts of the protein. When the protein first originated, probably in the first nucleated cell, when that first happened, it had so many functions that no part of it could change, and so it has stayed the same. There's only one difference between mammals and peas. Now, you could say that's due to the same designer. I say it's due to common ancestry way back in the very first nucleated cell, the eukaryotic cell. How can we test which of those is true? Well, the DNA that encodes that protein can change, because the genetic code that goes from a DNA to a protein there's several different DNAs that can encode the same protein. So evolution would predict that if you looked at the DNA, even though all organisms, from plants to mammals and everything in between, has almost identical histone H3, you would predict that when you look at the DNA and the similarities in the genes of the histone H3 gene, you would come up with a family tree like the ones I showed you before, and that is what we find. If those were all created, you would predict that one of two things should happen. Either the creator would, if the proteins are all the same, why wouldn't the creator make all the DNAs the same? Might just choose the codons from the genetic code to use at random, and then there would be no relationship between the DNAs at all. Or they might be chosen so that the same DNA was used in all cases. But you certainly would not predict the pattern that's actually seen. And that, to me, I never formally studied evolution, but I started out as a biochemist and learning about these proteins. And that sort of thing, to me, is so convincing of common ancestry that it wouldn't matter if there were fossils or not.
Okay, Dr. Paulson.
Okay.
We just got 5 minutes left, and that would give you opportunity for a question to Dr. Hovind.
Okay, I guess I'd like to pin Dr. Hovind down one more time on the idea of what predictions his hypothesis makes. And I'd like him to share with us one prediction that the hypothesis of creation makes, hypothesis of creationism, 6,000 years ago and all that. One prediction that would distinguish it from evolution, one case where it makes a different prediction, and secondly, a prediction by which it could conceivably be falsified.
Well, you kind of did what that other guy did. You asked about 5 questions. Just give me one. Narrow that down to one for me. Can you try it one more time? Because I only got 5 minutes to answer this. Pick one. Which one do you like the worst?
just show me a prediction that distinguishes creationism from evolution.
Creation predicts that animals will bring forth after their kind. And if you look around the world in all the breeding experiments and accidents, that's all we're seeing, is they're bringing forth after their kind. I gave you my predictions. There's going to be animals that produce after their kind and plants that produce after their kind. There will be no intermediates between basic kinds. I gave you a definition of kind, capable of reproducing. Your definition of species was interesting, that is similar to my definition of kind, animals capable of reproducing, and yet a dog and a wolf are different species. But they can interbreed, so you don't have a good definition of species, I don't think either. And again, we're arguing back to between micro and macro. Where's the border line? That's what the whole argument is about here. Where's the line between micro and macroevolution? I don't know exactly the definition of all the kinds, but I think the vast majority are pretty obvious, and a 3-year-old can tell you that a banana and a dog are a different kind of animal. So my prediction would be that animals would only be observed to bring forth after their kind, and that fossils we would find would be similar to living fossils today, living animals today, or plants, and that there will be no evidence whatsoever in the living world or in the dead world of anything in between basic kinds of animals. That's what I predict based upon the creation model, and we have yet to see any evidence to the contrary of that. I predict, for one thing, fossils don't form very readily. Millions of buffalo were slaughtered out west in the last few hundred years. I defy you to go find one fossilized buffalo. The existence of fossils, period, is very good evidence of a flood. Soft-bodied animals like worms and jellyfish are found fossilized. Had to be buried instantly. They'd have been decayed or scavenged in a few moments down in the ocean in the real world. So the existence of fossils in twisted, contorted positions and disarticulated fossils where they rotted for a few months and then were finally buried in giant piles of bones. We covered that in video number 6 of my series about all the fossil graveyards, are such powerful proof for a flood. So I gave you my predictions that we'll find animals that only produce after their kind in the living, and we won't find fossils of anything in between. And we'll find zillions of fossils buried in the ground. As far as something that would falsify that, well, then the opposite. If we don't find any fossils buried in the ground, then probably that's good evidence there wasn't a flood. If we find animals regularly producing different kinds other than themselves, wildly different kinds, that are also capable of reproducing, that would be good evidence. That would falsify the creation theory. And yet I'd like to see those. There is none of that. There's no evidence for that.
All right, if each of you would like to make a closing statement, a brief closing statement on your behalf, we would take those now.
How long will that be? 2 minutes?
We won't time you. It's
long as you
keep
want.
it somewhat brief.
Well, in that case, I'm glad I'm going first. Well, I would just like to reply to the answer to my question that Dr. Hovind just gave. I understood him to say that his hypothesis of creationism predicts that all the fossils in the ground would be the same as fossils that are alive today. That sounded like what he said. He certainly said something about there not being any transitional fossils between the groups that are alive today. And when he tells you that there aren't, he is quite simply ignoring lots of paleontological work and lots of fossils that have been discovered. They're out there, and the thing that makes evolution science, one of the things that makes evolution science is that when people make claims, other people can check them out. Those fossils are there in museums and laboratories, so people can check them from themselves, and they are some that are clearly transitional. So that would tend to disprove creationism, if that's a really firm prediction of it, that those shouldn't exist. He also says that creationism predicts that there should be zillions of fossils.